Hey everybody, Cody Meyer here. Summertime is finally here, and it's a great time to be out in the water to catch a lot of fish and to catch some really big fish. And I want to share with you guys 3 baits, really my 3-pronged approach to how I break down summertime, how I catch more fish on certain baits, and what to throw, where to throw them. You know, for starters, I'm always going to have a topwater bait. You know, this is something I start off every single morning with. You know, in the summertime, you know, the fish they're done spawning. They're completely, you know, post-spawn. They're now moving back out, you know, from the back of creeks out to the main lake. You know, bigger points, you know, any type of that main lake grass. So, you know, a topwater is gonna be a must-have bait. For one, fish are schooling. You know, they're getting back on big shad, on gizzard shad, on hitch, wherever you're at. They're on some kind of bait fish, and so a topwater is always gonna be a really good bait for that. You know, I like to throw this thing, you know, really all day, but for sure in the morning, you know, when the sun is low, it's low light conditions, you know, I'm gonna fish this thing again, you know, around grass, around a point, docks, anything where I felt like those fish were spawning and they move back out and they're gonna be near some deep water, somewhere where they're gonna set up for the summertime. You know, it's always a good idea to have a walking bait like this. This is a Strike King Sexy Dog. We make 3 sizes in this bait, but the Sexy Dog is really, you know, this is the medium one. This is really my go-to. I would say 90% of the time, this is what I'm throwing. And certain colors are gonna be better for different parts of the country. You know, I personally like, you know, something like this Sexy Chrome, but you know, if we were up in New York or something, we'd go to a perch, but this Sexy Chrome puts off a lot of flash. It walks really, really well. And again, it's something I'm gonna have on my deck. Anytime throughout the day, if I hear something blow up, I'm gonna pick this thing up, throw it out there, and catch some of those schooling fish. The retrieve on this bait is really easy as well. You know, it's a walking the dog, you know, back and forth. Very easy to do, short twitches with the rod tip. You're gonna get a lot of action out of this. One thing you can see on here, I like to use a braided line to a fluorocarbon leader. And I'm gonna go over the details of the exact setup at the end of this video. But that's a must-have. And the hooks, you know, this is an Owner STX 38 size number 4. You know, I always upgrade my hooks. I feel like, you know, the hooks, it's so important, especially on a topwater. You know, a lot of these fish are gonna come up and slap at this bait, so you need really, really sharp hooks to hook a lot of those fish. But again, we're gonna start the morning off always with something like this, a Strike King Sexy Dog, a topwater. Again, you know, the water temperature is up in the summertime. These fish are really getting active now. They have to eat a lot throughout the day to maintain, you know, really their body weight. So I'm gonna start off with that, but I'm gonna keep it on the deck throughout the day in case some fish come up schooling. You know, the next thing I love to throw, this is a Strike King 5XD. You know, I'm gonna really throw a crankbait a lot during the summertime. Again, those fish have moved off. You know, they're off a little bit deeper, and when they go down from the topwater, this is what I'm gonna focus on, you know, a crankbait. And really this 5XD is a perfect crankbait for the summertime. You know, this is a great bait for the 8 to 12 foot depth range. And a lot of those fish, that's where they're gonna be. You know, they're gonna be right on the break, maybe where they're up first thing in the morning, and they're gonna be kinda, you know, down a little bit deeper. You know, I like to throw this crankbait, you know, on rock, on brush. I'm gonna look on my Garmin unit. I'm gonna really find some transition points of where I think they're gonna move to after that first, you know, feeding in the morning. And then I'm gonna target on this crankbait. Again, this is really easy to throw. You know, I like to throw this on a 7.2 medium crankbait rod, small to medium crankbait rod with a lighter line. You know, that's one thing that's very important with the crankbait. You know, I like a 10 to a 12 pound test fluorocarbon and a slower gear ratio in a reel. But I'm gonna throw this thing out there. I'm gonna make a really long cast. I'm gonna put the rod tip down and crank it. And the goal is here, you wanna make contact with the bottom. You know, deflection is really key with this bait. So if I'm cranking it down, I deflect off a rock. I'm gonna pause that bait briefly. That's when you're gonna get a lot of your strikes, you know, a lot of really good strikes as well. Color, you know, again, it's gonna be depending on where you're at, but I stick with the shad colors. With this 5XD, you know, we make some great colors. We also have a rattling version and a silent version as well. You know, that's really gonna just depend on water clarity is how I'm gonna choose which one. You can see I have also upgraded the hooks on these. You know, that's gonna be a must-have for me. Again, these are owner STX 38s, again, size 4, you know, the same hook as the Sexy Dawg, but this is, again, my go-to hook, really, with all reaction baits. It's a lighter wire hook, it's you know, sticky sharp, it's got this silky gray finish on it, really hooks them well. You know, lastly but not least, summertime is a great time to catch big fish deep out of brush piles, you know, again, on those deeper ledges, on a big worm. And this is a Strike King 10-inch bullworm. You know, growing up in California, fishing Clear Lake, fishing the Delta, you know, we've always thrown big worms. And then really, as I transitioned to going, you know, back east, fishing back east, I found out how much of a staple a big worm is for almost all anglers. You know, this is, again, the Strike King bullworm. This is a great worm. For one, you're gonna have this tail. There's a little cup at the end here. This moves a lot of water. Again, in the summertime, you know, these fish, they have to eat a lot, you know, so they want a bigger meal. And when you put this big worm in a brush pile and really kind of dance it right in their face, it's gonna be hard for them to resist. You know, I like to stick with natural colors, you know, not really like a black and blue unless that water's pretty dirty. But you know, something like green pumpkin purple, a plum, you know, plum candy, something like that. Very, very natural, and you're gonna get a lot of bites. As far as how I rigged this thing, you know, this is a Strike King tour grade tungsten, 3/8 of an ounce sinker. And I personally don't like a peg it on here. You know, I don't like a bobber stop or to peg this weight. I want this thing to swing on its own. That way, when the weight goes down, it's gonna hit and the worms are gonna slowly follow behind it. And it seems like you get a lot more bites like that, especially in those big brush piles. The hook here, this is an owner J hook, a 5/0. You know, this is a great hook. And you can see this is a big bait here, right? So when a fish bite it, it's gonna be a violent bite, a really good, you know, thunk. And I like to let them eat it for a second and then reel down and set the hook. So, you know, again, it's a bigger hook, but you really have to let these fish eat this big worm. You know, as far as the setup, again, I like a little bit longer of a rod, you know, an 8-foot, maybe 7.5 foot rod, a 15 really to a 20-pound fluorocarbon. And that's what's gonna, you know, do it for me in the summertime to catch a lot of these fish. And again, catching big fish. So I wanna start from the top here, really go over the whole setup, go down to exactly what I'm throwing. We're gonna start off with the Sexy Dawg here. You know, as far as the rod and reel, this is a 7.3 Daiwa Tatula Elite multi-purpose rod designed by Brent Ayler. This is the rod I recommend for throwing topwaters, making that really long cast. It's gonna work the bait properly, and it's a you know, medium heavy bend on this rod, so it's gonna really have a lot of bend to it. You're not gonna pull these hooks out. So I recommend this rod, but if you're looking for a rod, a 7-foot to a 7.6 possibly, rod is gonna do the trick, you know, making that long cast. You just want a pretty light rod, nothing too stiff, because again, you're dealing with treble hooks here, and I really don't want you guys to pull the hooks out. You know, I mentioned briefly the line here. What I like to do is I like to take a 30 to a 40-pound braided line. You know, this is a Daiwa J-braid. Run that, and then I have a little bit of a fluorocarbon leader. This is a 20-pound Daiwa J-Fluoro fluorocarbon leader. Again, why I like to do that, for one, when you don't have this leader, the braid will get in this front hook a lot. So when you're working this bait, it's gonna foul up, and it seems to always happen when there's a big one blowing up, and it'll foul up the bait. So I like to do about a 10-inch fluorocarbon leader. It makes that bait work a lot better. And plus, if you're one that believes that the fish can see the line, they're not gonna be able to see that. And it seems like that's a big deal for getting the distance out of the cast and properly working the bait. And then of course with the braided line, you just have to lean into them and you're gonna get a really good hook set. You know, as far as the reel goes, this is the new Daiwa Tatula Elite reel. This is a phenomenal reel to get a lot of distance out of that cast. You know, this is a reel I really prefer. It's got the T-wing system in here. You know, it's got the MagForce system. And this is just, like I said, a good reel to get a lot of distance out of a cast. Gear ratio here, I like the fastest gear ratio you can get in a reel. You know, this is an 8.1. Again, you're making a long cast, you're working the bait. can't tell you how many times a fish is blown up, so I've cranked this reel in, cranked the bait in, and fired it somewhere where I see a fish blowing up. So that is a really, really big deal. You know, that's the setup here for this Topwater, for the Strike King Sexy Dog. Now we're on to the crankbait. You know, the crankbait, again, this is very important to have the right gear, right setup. You know, this is a new rod, again, designed by Brent Ayler. It's a 7.2 small to medium crankbait rod. Again, a Daiwa Tattoo Elite rod. You know, this rod is very, very good for throwing a crankbait. Very parabolic. It has that glass rod feel to it, you know, but it's also very sensitive. When you're throwing it out there, you're ticking every rock. You can feel everything. As far as the line goes, you know, this is a Daiwa J-Fluoro 10-pound test. I like a 10 to a 12-pound test fluorocarbon, maybe 14, 15, if you're fishing some real heavy cover and the water's a little bit more stained. But keep in mind, the lighter the line, the more depth you're gonna get out of this crankbait. You know, these baits were designed to run around that, you know, this one, that 10, 12, 13 feet. But to achieve that, you need that lighter line. So again, this is a Daiwa J-Fluoro. As far as a reel, this is a Daiwa Steez A with the T-wing in here. Great reel for this bait. You know, it holds a lot of line. You know, it got some eye knob handles. I love this reel for firing around a crankbait. You know, if it's windy, calm, it's not gonna affect the action of this bait, how you cast it. So again, this is one of my go-to reels. And again, the gear ratio, you know, I like a 6.3 up to a 7.1. You know, you can get away with a little bit higher of a gear ratio on a crankbait in the summertime. But typically, if you're looking for one reel, it's gonna be that 6.3 gear ratio, something like this Daiwa Steez A. Last but not least, you know, the big worm. You know, this is very important. You know, if you're throwing a big worm on too light of a rod, you're not gonna drive this hook home. Again, this is a big piece of plastic right here, so I want the right setup. You know, so I like an 8-foot flipping stick. You know, this is a Daiwa Tattoo Elite 8-foot flipping stick designed by Ish Monroe. But I've also thrown it a lot on like the 7-foot 6-inch medium heavy rod, again, a flipping stick. But I recommend something like this, you know, 7.5 to an 8-foot rod. I like something with a little bit more tip. That way you can properly work the bait. But bottom line, you need something where when you get that bite, you can reel down, you're gonna have a lot of line out there, you need to drive that hook home. So I like a bigger rod. You know, as far as the line goes, I like something, again, a little bit bigger. This is a 16-pound Daiwa J-Fluoro, but really that 15 to 20-pound fluorocarbon line is what you need for throwing this big worm. You know, that's really gonna be a must-have. And the reel, you know, this is that new Daiwa Tatula SV103 and a high gear ratio, 7.1 gear ratio. The Tatula SV103 is really, really good for throwing this big worm. Again, you're gonna have the SV spool in there. If that wind comes up and you're making a long cast of this thing, you know, the wind tends to catch these worms. So that SV spool is gonna help eliminate backlashes, but then, you know, you're still gonna get that distance out of that cast. So that's a really, really big deal. Also, I mentioned the 7.1 gear ratio. You know, I want something 7.1, 8.1, something with a lot of power, a high speed where you make that long cast, you get that bite, you can reel down and really drive the hook home and have control of that fish. So, you know, hopefully that helps, guys. Again, those are my 3 must-haves really for summertime fishing. No matter where you're at in the country, this stuff is gonna work, and hopefully this is gonna catch you a lot more fish during the dog days of summer.